Autopsy reports reveal as Hulk Hogan's real cause of death exposed. Fans worldwide are stunned as newly released autopsy reports uncover the truth behind Hulk Hogan's shocking passing. What the media didn't tell you, we will. This is the untold story wrestling fans have been waiting for. In this video, we break down every detail from the autopsy findings, reveal behind-the-scenes truths, and explore the unanswered questions surrounding one of wrestling's most iconic figures. If you thought you knew the full story, think again. Just last week, the wrestling world was shaken to its core. The man whose name was synonymous with professional wrestling, whose larger-than-life presence once electrified arenas, is gone, and now, in the wake of his passing, the truth is spilling into the open in a way no one could have imagined. Hulk Hogan, the immortal icon, the face of wrestling's golden era, has been the subject of endless speculation since news of his death broke. But today, newly released autopsy reports have pulled back the curtain on the real cause of death. What was whispered behind closed doors is now out in the open, and what's inside these pages is already sending shockwaves through the WWE universe, the sports world, and far beyond. This isn't the sanitized version of events you might hear in a brief news segment or a carefully worded WWE tribute package. This is the unfiltered story, the one that will force even the most die-hard fans to see Hogan's final chapter in a different light. For decades, he was the embodiment of strength and charisma, a man who made fans believe in heroes. But in his final days, away from the blinding lights and roaring crowds, his body was telling a story no camera could capture, one of years of punishment, relentless travel, and silent suffering. And now, the official autopsy has confirmed it. Hulk Hogan's death wasn't sudden. It was the culmination of a battle he had been fighting far longer than anyone realized. The report, obtained from the Florida State Medical Examiner's Office, is clinical in its language but devastating in its revelations. It notes the exact condition that claimed his life, the complications that made recovery impossible, and the physical toll of decades in an industry that demands more than most can give. Fans knew Hogan had endured multiple surgeries over the years: hips, knees, back, shoulders, each one a reminder of the sacrifices he made to stay in the ring. But what the autopsy reveals is how those injuries created a cascade of health issues that eventually became irreversible. His heart, once strong enough to carry the weight of a global wrestling empire, was now ailing. His lungs showed scarring from past infections. And most startling of all, the toxicology report revealed traces of medications that painted a troubling picture of his pain management in his final months. What is perhaps most haunting about the document is how it reframes Hogan's last public appearances. In photos and videos from just months before his passing, he still carried himself like a legend, smiling, shaking hands, and taking pictures with fans. But according to insiders close to the family, Hogan was struggling in private, fighting through chronic pain, bouts of breathlessness, and the kind of fatigue that would leave him unable to leave bed for days at a time. Those close to him say he was still pushing himself to attend events, to meet commitments, because that's who Hulk Hogan was, a man who couldn't bring himself to say no to the fans who had made him. One longtime friend, who spoke on condition of anonymity, said reading the autopsy report was like seeing the final scoreboard after a lifetime of battles. We all knew Terry, referring to Hogan by his real name, Terry Bollea, wasn't invincible. But the way he kept going, you'd forget he was human. This report, it's hard to see in black and white. It's not just about how he died, it's about everything he endured to get there. The report details how cardiovascular complications were the immediate cause of death, but it's the contributing factors that raise questions. Years of physical trauma had placed enormous strain on his body. Spinal compression from repeated leg drops, knee joint degeneration from countless matches, nerve damage from neck injuries, all of it took a toll. Doctors had long warned him about the cumulative damage, but Hogan was a man who built his identity on pushing through the pain. And according to the autopsy, that pain wasn't just physical, it was chemical. Toxicology results showed elevated levels of prescribed painkillers and anti-inflammatory drugs, consistent with a man managing severe chronic pain. There was no sign of illegal substances, but the report makes it clear that his body had been walking a tightrope, balancing between relief and danger. In the weeks leading up to his passing, friends noticed Hogan seemed more withdrawn, speaking less during public meet and greets, often leaning on furniture for support. It's now believed those were early signs of the cardiovascular episode that would ultimately take his life. Yet, even as his health declined, Hogan kept his struggles private. For years, he had been the man who told kids to train, say your prayers, and eat your vitamins. Admitting weakness was never part of the script. In the wrestling world, protecting the image is as important as protecting the body. And so the public never saw the full picture until now. The Autopsy's release has sparked a wave of reaction from fans and fellow wrestlers alike. Tributes have poured in, but so have calls for greater awareness about the long-term health risks of professional wrestling. Inside the WWE, sources say Hogan's death and the details of his autopsy have reignited conversations about how the company supports its legends after they retire. While Hogan remained on good terms with WWE in his final years, many are now asking if more could have been done to help him manage the health consequences of his career. Former colleagues have spoken out in interviews, saying that the industry has a responsibility to ensure its icons are not left to quietly suffer once the spotlight fades. The wrestling community, always quick to mythologize its heroes, is now faced with a more complicated reality. Hogan's story was never just about victory, it was about survival. And in the end, survival became harder and harder to achieve. The autopsy notes multiple organ systems showing signs of long-term stress, particularly his cardiovascular and musculoskeletal systems. These findings suggest that while the immediate cause of death was a heart-related event, it was a body-wide breakdown years in the making. In Clearwater, Florida, where Hogan had lived for years, the news has hit especially hard. Fans have been leaving flowers, championship belts, and handwritten letters outside his beachfront mansion. One letter, left anonymously, reads simply, "Thank you for being my hero, even when you were hurting." For many, learning the truth about Hogan's final days has deepened their respect for him, not diminished it. They see a man who gave everything to his fans, even when it cost him everything. The media coverage, however, has been mixed. Some outlets have chosen to focus on the more sensational aspects of the toxicology report, while others have framed it as a cautionary tale about the hidden toll of fame and physical sacrifice. Behind the scenes, there is also quiet tension within Hogan's circle. The decision to release the autopsy was not unanimous. Some family members reportedly felt it should have remained private, a final boundary around a life that had been lived so publicly. But in the end, the release was seen as a way to set the record straight, to silence the endless speculation and misinformation. Among wrestling insiders, there's talk that Hogan knew his time was short. In the months before his death, he reportedly reached out to several old friends and rivals, making peace where there had been bitterness, reminiscing about their shared history. One former tag partner said Hogan had confided in him about feeling worn down and ready for the next chapter, whatever that is. At the time, it was taken as a philosophical comment. Now, in light of the autopsy, it feels like a quiet goodbye. Perhaps the most striking part of the autopsy isn't the medical jargon or the cold, clinical cause of death, it's the story those findings tell when you connect them to the man's life. Every injury, every surgery, every mile on the road left its mark. Hulk Hogan wasn't just a performer, he was a man who lived at the edge of human limits for decades. And like so many in the industry, he paid the price in the most personal way. As fans process this new information, there is a growing sense that Hogan's legacy will now be defined not just by his in-ring achievements, but by the honesty of his final chapter. The truth revealed in the autopsy is uncomfortable, but it's also humanizing. It strips away the invincibility and reminds us that behind the bandanas and the booming promos was a man who hurt, who aged, and who eventually couldn't out-wrestle the inevitable. And yet, even in death, Hulk Hogan remains larger than life. His passing and the revelations that followed have reignited conversations about health, loyalty, and the price of living as a legend. For those who grew up watching him, the news is bittersweet. The hero may be gone, but the memories remain, and now so does the truth. What the media didn't tell you before, the autopsy has made impossible to ignore. The question now is whether the wrestling world will learn from it, or whether Hogan's fate will be just another chapter in a long line of tragedies that could have been prevented. The shock is still fresh. The grief is still raw. But in the coming days, as the initial headlines fade, the deeper story will remain. The story of a man who lived for his fans, who sacrificed his body for the love of the business, and whose final moments are now forever etched in the cold lines of an autopsy report. And perhaps, just perhaps, that truth will inspire change, so that future legends won't have to follow the same path to the same end. The day the report was released, wrestling forums exploded with theories, questions, and heartbreak. Some fans clung to disbelief, unwilling to accept that their hero's end could be traced to such stark medical facts. Others said the report brought them closure, an end to the rumors and the what-ifs. Former wrestlers took to social media to share stories of Hogan's generosity backstage, his willingness to help young talent, and his insistence on giving the crowd their money's worth no matter how much he was hurting. For those who knew him best, the report was both a confirmation and a reminder. A confirmation of the struggles they had quietly witnessed, and a reminder of the fragility that lies beneath the persona of every wrestling superstar. And as the wrestling world continues to mourn, one thing is certain: the real cause of Hulk Hogan's death is no longer a mystery. It is a truth that will be told and retold for years to come, a truth that adds depth to the legend, and a truth that ensures his story will never be forgotten. In the days following the release of the autopsy report, the wrestling industry's public face, the one polished for cameras, fans, and sponsors, began to crack. Behind closed doors, the conversations were not about storyline angles, pay-per-view sales, or merchandise numbers. They were about mortality, about the haunting reality that the man who once defined the word immortal was gone because of a very human set of failings. At WWE headquarters in Stamford, Connecticut, the atmosphere was eerily subdued. Normally, even during moments of tragedy, the office hummed with the machinery of business. There were tribute packages to produce, charity appearances to coordinate, social media to manage. But the autopsy had made this loss different. It had stripped away the safe, celebratory narrative the company usually wrapped around a fallen star. This time, the truth was inescapable. Hogan hadn't simply passed peacefully at home, as some early statements implied. His body had been worn down, piece by piece, by the same business that had built him into a household name. Executives huddled in glass-walled conference rooms, debating how much of the autopsy's contents to acknowledge publicly. Some argued for transparency, pointing to the public's hunger for authenticity and the chance to address the health crises plaguing retired wrestlers. Others wanted to steer the conversation back toward Hogan's career highlights, to focus on his immortal legacy and avoid dwelling on the grim details. For hours, they went back and forth, knowing that no matter what they chose, the wrestling community was already deep into its own conversation, far beyond corporate control. Meanwhile, in Clearwater, Hogan's family and closest friends were trying to navigate a different kind of fallout. The mansion that had once been a lively hub for visiting wrestlers, family gatherings, and spontaneous barbecues had become a makeshift command center for grief. People came and went quietly, delivering meals, bringing flowers, or just sitting in silence in the living room where Hogan had spent so many evenings telling stories of the road. In the center of it all was his daughter, Brooke, clutching a framed photo of her father from his early wrestling days, before the fame was global, before the surgeries, before the toll became so visible. Everyone's talking about how he died, she confided to a close friend, but I just want them to remember how he lived. It was a sentiment echoed by many in the family, torn between the need to protect Hogan's privacy and the reality that the details of his death were now public record. His son, Nick, reportedly spent hours poring over the autopsy report himself, not as a fan or a journalist, but as a son trying to understand the chain of events that had led to the moment he would never forget, the call telling him his father was gone. Those who had shared locker rooms with Hogan over the decades were equally shaken. Veteran wrestlers, men and women who had worked the same punishing schedules and endured the same injuries, saw in Hogan's death a mirror of their own futures. On podcasts, they began speaking with unusual candor about the culture of pushing through pain, of hiding injuries to keep the storyline alive. "If Hulk Hogan can't survive it," one former world champion said grimly, "what chance do the rest of us have?" At one small memorial gathering of wrestling alumni in Tampa, the conversation turned almost inevitably to the elephant in the room. Could his death have been prevented? A few insisted that once the damage to his body had reached a certain point, there was no turning back. But others pointed to moments in his post-WWE years when interventions, whether medical, personal, or institutional, might have made a difference. The autopsy's confirmation of cardiovascular failure and the presence of multiple prescription medications became focal points in the debate. Some friends, however, were quick to defend Hogan's choices. They reminded everyone that he had lived on his own terms, that he had refused to slow down even when his body begged him to. He had made appearances, filmed commercials, and mentored younger wrestlers until the very end. He'd say, "Brother, I'll rest when I'm gone," one longtime friend recalled, his voice breaking. And I guess now he finally is. Back in Stamford, WWE leadership decided to proceed with a two-pronged approach. A public celebration of Hogan's life and career for the fans, paired with private conversations within the industry about health, safety, and post-career support. Vince McMahon, no longer at the center of WWE's day-to-day operations, but still an influential figure, reportedly told executives that Hogan's passing was a wake-up call the business can't ignore. Behind the scenes, there were whispers of new health monitoring programs for retired wrestlers, expanded medical benefits, and more mental health resources, though whether these would materialize remained to be seen. Fan reaction, too, was evolving. In the first hours after the autopsy release, the internet was flooded with shock, sorrow, and speculation. But as days passed, the tone shifted. Hashtags like #ThankYouHogan and #ForeverImmortal began trending, with fans sharing personal stories of meeting him, of how he had inspired them during difficult times, of the joy he brought to their childhoods. It was a reminder that while the cause of his death was a sobering reality, it could not erase the decades of moments that had made Hulk Hogan more than just a wrestler to millions. Yet the unanswered questions lingered. Why had his health reached such a critical state without more public awareness? Were there signs that those around him had missed or chosen to ignore? And what did it say about the wrestling industry that one of its most beloved figures had been quietly fighting for his life, while still smiling for the cameras?
One thing was clear, the autopsy had done more than explain how Hulk Hogan died. It had ignited a reckoning, one that was reverberating through locker rooms, boardrooms, and living rooms alike. In telling the truth about his death, it had forced the wrestling world to confront the cost of its spectacle and the fragility of the men and women who bring it to life. And in Clearwater, as the waves rolled in against the shore outside his home, the people who had loved Terry Bollea, not just Hulk Hogan, found themselves caught between grief and gratitude. Grief for the man they had lost, gratitude for the time they had, and for the indelible mark he had left on their lives. The legend was gone, but the lessons, and the truth, would endure. The locker room was never truly quiet, not in an industry built on constant motion, clanging weights, and the background hum of production equipment. But in the days after the autopsy reports on Hulk Hogan were made public, there was a different kind of silence in WWE's backstage areas, a silence that wasn't about respect for the dead, but about the uncomfortable truths his death had forced to the surface. In arenas across the country, before live events began, wrestlers gathered in small clusters, speaking in hushed tones. Some scrolled through their phones, rereading the same headlines, rewatching the same news clips, as if seeing the story one more time might make it less final. Others avoided eye contact altogether, gripping water bottles or wrapping their hands in tape just to have something to do with the nervous energy running through them. It wasn't just grief, it was recognition. Everyone in that locker room knew, on some level, that they were living the same life Hogan had lived. The same road miles, the same punishing schedule, the same injuries that were ignored or downplayed because the next show had to go on. Some of them had even wrestled through pain so severe they couldn't stand upright the next morning. And now, here was the biggest name the business had ever produced, gone not in a spectacular, tragic accident, but from the kind of long, grinding physical decline that could be creeping up on any one of them. Veterans of the business were particularly shaken. Men who had once shared cards with Hogan, who had laughed with him in hotel bars and traded stories about impossible crowds, were suddenly revisiting those memories with an ache they hadn't expected. One older wrestler, now working as a backstage producer, said quietly to a younger talent, "Brother, this is the real endgame nobody talks about. It's not about the matches, it's about what's left of you when the matches are over." Among the women's roster, the reaction was just as raw. Some of them had grown up watching Hogan on television, seeing him as a childhood superhero. Others had met him during charity events or autograph signings and remembered how he would crouch down to talk to a fan's child at eye level, or how his handshake was always firm but friendly. Reading about the physical state revealed in the autopsy made those memories bittersweet. The larger-than-life figure they remembered had been fighting a losing battle behind the scenes. The current generation of wrestlers began to talk openly, some for the first time, about pain management, about what they were taking just to get through the week, and about the fear of what those choices might mean 10 or 20 years from now. Hogan's autopsy, with its clear evidence of the toll that decades of physical punishment had taken, had stripped away any illusions about the price of staying in the game too long. Outside the locker room, the media was in overdrive. Sports outlets dissected every line of the autopsy report, breaking down the medical terminology for their viewers. Mainstream news programs debated whether the wrestling industry bore any responsibility for Hogan's condition, given how long he had worked hurt and how much of that was done under the banner of major promotions. Some commentators went further, pointing to a pattern. Names like Randy Savage, Roddy Piper, and Ultimate Warrior, legends who had also died too soon, often with health histories that told stories just as troubling. Hogan's autopsy, they argued, wasn't just about one man. It was about an industry that had never truly reckoned with the consequences of its demands. Other wrestling legends began to speak out. Ric Flair, a contemporary and longtime friend, gave a tearful interview in which he called the report heartbreaking, but not surprising. He spoke of the countless nights Hogan had wrestled hurt, of the way he'd ice his knees and back for hours after a show, and of how the two of them had once joked about outrunning the clock when it came to their bodies breaking down. "Turns out," Flair said, voice cracking, "the clock catches everyone." Stone Cold Steve Austin recorded a special episode of his podcast dedicated entirely to Hogan's life and the autopsy revelations. He didn't sugarcoat it. "Look, we all want to be the guy who goes out on top, who rides into the sunset healthy and happy," Austin said. "But this business, it'll chew you up and spit you out if you're not careful. And if Hulk Hogan couldn't beat that system, man, that tells you something." Bret Hart, who had his own history of career-ending injury, posted a long message on social media. He praised Hogan's contributions to the sport but also used the moment to advocate for mandatory post-career health checks for all wrestlers who had spent more than a decade on the road. "We can't just celebrate these men when they're young and strong," he wrote. "We need to take care of them when the lights go down." Even Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, who had been mentored by Hogan during his early WWE days, shared a heartfelt video. Standing in his gym, visibly emotional, he spoke about the first time Hogan pulled him aside and told him, "Brother, it's your time now." Johnson said the autopsy hurt because it revealed just how much my friend had been carrying without letting on to anyone. "The world saw a hero. I wish they could have seen the man, because that man carried more weight than anyone should." Meanwhile, fans were engaging in their own kind of reckoning. Message boards and fan groups filled with personal stories of meeting Hogan at meet and greets, running into him at diners, or catching a glimpse of him walking down the street in Clearwater. But mixed in with the nostalgia were threads about wrestler welfare, about how many more autopsies it would take before something changed. The conversation had shifted. It was no longer just about paying tribute to Hulk Hogan. It was about making sure his end wasn't repeated for the next generation. Younger wrestlers were paying attention. They were watching their heroes, their mentors, and in some cases, their friends, pass away from conditions that might have been slowed or prevented with earlier intervention. And they were starting to speak up. One anonymous WWE talent told a wrestling journalist, "I'm making changes now, cutting back on the stuff I take for pain, making sure I actually see a doctor instead of toughing it out." If Hogan's story doesn't scare you straight, nothing will. And yet, even with this flood of honesty and self-reflection, there was a shadow hanging over it all, the knowledge that Hogan's legacy, for all its triumphs, would now always be entwined with the truth revealed in that autopsy. Some fans didn't want to hear it. They wanted to remember the yellow and red, the real American anthem, the ear-cupping poses. Others said the truth made his story even more heroic. That he gave so much of himself to the fans that it literally cost him his life. In the end, that was the duality of Hulk Hogan's final chapter. The man who built an empire on strength, energy, and charisma had died from the cumulative cost of living up to that image. The autopsy didn't diminish the legend, it simply showed what it took to create one. And in a quiet moment, far from cameras or microphones, one of Hogan's oldest friends, standing outside the Clearwater mansion after a small family gathering, summed it up simply: "He gave us everything he had, and when that was gone, he still gave more. Now it's on us to make sure no one else has to go out the same way." In those final weeks before the news broke, before the autopsy became public record, Hulk Hogan's world had already begun to shrink. The man who once filled arenas, whose presence could command the energy of tens of thousands, now spent most of his time in the quiet rooms of his Clearwater mansion, surrounded by the steady hum of the ocean outside. Friends who visited say the transformation was gradual but undeniable. The larger-than-life figure in bandana and shades still greeted them with his trademark "brother." But his voice was softer, the laugh a little shorter. He walked slower now, sometimes gripping the edge of a counter for support. Yet there was a warmth about him, a deepening of something in his eyes, as though he'd decided to spend whatever time he had left holding on to the people and moments that mattered most. Those closest to him say Hogan knew his body was failing. The years of surgeries, the endless miles on the road, the countless nights working through pain, all of it had caught up to him. But what he didn't share publicly was just how much every movement cost him. Getting up from a chair could leave him winded. Climbing a flight of stairs took concentration. And on the nights when pain kept him awake, he would sit by the window overlooking the Gulf of Mexico, watching the moonlight ripple on the water. He'd say, "Brother, this is the only crowd I need now," recalled one close friend. "The waves, the wind, and maybe a cold drink if my doctor doesn't find out." It was a joke, but underneath it was the truth. Hogan had made peace with the fact that he would never step into a wrestling ring again. As his health declined, his inner circle grew tighter. Only a handful of people were allowed to visit unannounced: his children, Brooke and Nick, a few lifelong friends, and a couple of trusted former colleagues who had been with him through both the glory years and the darker times. They kept the visits light, reminiscing about old matches, laughing over botched promos and travel disasters, watching grainy VHS tapes of their earliest days in the business. But there were also the serious conversations. Hogan had always been fiercely protective of his image, but in those private talks, he spoke openly about the toll the industry had taken. They cheered for Hulk Hogan, he told one visitor, but Terry Bollea paid the price. It was a rare separation of the man from the myth, and it struck everyone who heard it that he was trying to make sure they understood the difference. Brooke, his daughter, was a constant presence in those days. She'd bring homemade meals, fuss over his medication schedule, and sit with him in the afternoons as he dozed in his recliner. He'd wake up, smile, and ask what match we were watching, she said later. Sometimes it was just an old western on TV, but I'd play along. For Brooke, those small, quiet moments were as valuable as any public tribute could ever be. Nick's visits were different. As a son, he carried his own complicated history with his father, and in those final weeks, there was a sense of both reconciliation and urgency. The two would sit on the back deck, fishing lines in the water, sometimes talking, sometimes not. "We didn't need to fill the air," Nick told a family friend after the funeral. "I just needed to be there." Hogan's health scares in the last month became more frequent: shortness of breath, dizzy spells, episodes where he'd grip the arm of his chair until his knuckles went white. His doctor had been urging hospitalization, but Hogan resisted. "I want to be here," he told them. "I want to hear the ocean. If it's my time, I want it to be here, not under hospital lights." The week before his death, Hogan called a small gathering at the house. No cameras, no press. Just the people who had been in his life long enough to see both the man and the legend. They sat in his living room, surrounded by championship belts, framed photos, and memorabilia from decades in the business. Hogan, wearing a simple t-shirt and sweats, spoke without bravado. "I had the run of a lifetime," he said. "And if I could do it again, I'd probably do it all the same, because even with all the pain, I got to live my dream. But don't make the mistake of thinking I was invincible. None of us are." His words lingered in the room long after he'd finished. 3 nights later, the final turn came quietly. It was late evening, and the house was still. Brooke had been by earlier that day, and Nick had promised to stop in the next morning. Hogan sat in his favorite chair by the window, the soft sound of waves drifting through the open glass doors. At some point, he fell asleep. When the sun rose over Clearwater Beach, he was still there. Head tilted back, eyes closed, a faint smile on his face. Paramedics were called, but it was too late. The man the world knew as Hulk Hogan had left peacefully, in the home he loved, in the place he had chosen. The days that followed were a blur of arrangements, statements, and an outpouring of tributes from every corner of the wrestling world. But there was also a layer of privacy around his final moments, something his family guarded fiercely. They knew the autopsy would tell the medical story of his death, but the emotional truth belonged to them. At the private funeral held at his Clearwater mansion, the crowd was small. Close friends, family, a handful of fellow wrestlers. The ceremony was held on the lawn, overlooking the water. A simple wooden casket rested under the shade of palm trees, draped not in the American flag, but in one of Hogan's iconic red and yellow feather boas. It was both solemn and unmistakably him. Brooke spoke first, her voice breaking but strong enough to carry. She talked about the father who made her pancakes shaped like championship belts, who taught her how to swim by pretending they were in a WrestleMania main event. Nick followed, recalling late-night drives after small-town shows when they'd talk about everything but wrestling. Then came the tributes from the wrestling family. Ric Flair told a story about the first time he faced Hogan in the ring, and how even backstage, he couldn't tell if Hogan was still cutting a promo or just being himself. Dwayne Johnson shared how Hogan's advice, "Always listen to the crowd, brother," had shaped his career. Bret Hart, standing a little apart from the others, simply said, "We didn't always agree. But I always respected him. And I'll miss him." As the service drew to a close, the sun dipped lower, painting the sky in gold and red, the colors that had defined Hogan's career. The casket was carried out slowly, the sound of the waves blending with the quiet sobs of those gathered. Some fans had gathered on the beach below, holding up signs and chanting his name one last time. When the final prayer was said, Brooke and Nick each placed one hand on the casket, whispered their goodbyes, and stepped back. The man who had been a superhero to millions was gone, but the love in that moment, the love of a father, a friend, a brother in the business, was bigger than any crowd he had ever stood before. The autopsy may have revealed the cause of death. The media may have dissected his final days. But here, in this private farewell, Hulk Hogan's life was remembered not in medical terms, but in the stories, laughter, and gratitude of those who had truly known him. And for the first time in decades, there were no spotlights, no commentary tracks, just the quiet sound of the ocean and the certainty that legends never really die. This isn't the sanitized version of events you might hear in a brief news segment or a carefully worded WWE tribute package. This is the unfiltered story, the one that will force even the most die-hard fans to see Hogan's final chapter in a different light. For decades, He was the embodiment of strength and charisma, a man who made fans believe in heroes. But in his final days, away from the blinding lights and roaring crowds, his body was telling a story no camera could capture, one of years of punishment, relentless travel, and silent suffering. And now, the official autopsy has confirmed it. Hulk Hogan's death wasn't sudden, it was the culmination of a battle he had been fighting far longer than anyone realized. The report, obtained from the Florida State Medical Examiner's Office, is clinical in its language but devastating in its revelations. It notes the exact condition that claimed his life, the complications that made recovery impossible, and the physical toll of decades in an industry that demands more than most can give. Fans knew Hogan had endured multiple surgeries over the years: hips, knees, back, shoulders, each one a reminder of the sacrifices he made to stay in the ring. But what the autopsy reveals is how those injuries created a cascade of health issues that eventually became irreversible. His heart, once strong enough to carry the weight of a global wrestling empire, was now ailing. His lungs showed scarring from past infections. And most startling of all, the toxicology report revealed traces of medications that painted a troubling picture of his pain management in his final months.
One former rival
perhaps
remembered
most
a
haunting
match in
about the
Tokyo
document
where
is how
Hogan
it
took an
reframes
awkward
Hogan's
fall
last
and landed
public
hard on
appearances.
his shoulder. In photos and
Backstage,
videos from
they
just
thought he
months
might have
before
torn
his
something.
passing, but
He
when
still
his
carried
music hit
himself
for the
like a
encore
legend.
appearance,
Smiling,
he walked back
shaking
out,
hands,
flexing
taking
and
pictures
grinning
with
as though
fans.
nothing had happened.
But according to
That's the
insiders
thing about
close
Terry,
to the family,
the rival said
Hogan
softly.
was struggling in
He knew the
private,
fans
fighting
had
through
paid to
chronic
see
pain,
Hulk Hogan,
bouts of
not a guy
breathlessness,
nursing an
and the
injury.
kind of fatigue
But
that
every
would
time
leave
he
him
did that,
unable to
he
leave
was
bed
making
for
a deal
days
with
at
his
a time.
body he couldn't
Those
keep
close
forever.
to him say he was
As
still
these
pushing
memories
himself
spilled
to
out in
attend
kitchens,
events,
on
to meet
porches,
commitments,
and in late-night
because
phone
that's
calls
who
between
Hulk Hogan
friends.
was.
A picture
man
began
who
to
couldn't
form,
bring himself
not
to
of a
say no
man
to the
brought down
fans who
suddenly by
admired him.
fate,
One
but of a
longtime
man who had
friend
spent
who
40
spoke on
years
condition
giving
of
more than his
anonymity
body could
said
ever
reading
repay.
the autopsy
The
report was
autopsy
like
hadn't
seeing the
revealed
final
anything new to
scoreboard
those who knew
after
him
a
best.
lifetime of
It
battles.
had simply confirmed
We all
what
knew
they had
Terry,
quietly
referring to
feared
Hogan
for
by
years.
his real name,
In
Terry
Stanford,
Bollea,
the
wasn't
WWE
invincible.
production
But
team
the way he
began
kept going,
sifting through
you'd forget
decades
he
of
was
footage
human.
for a documentary
This report,
tribute.
It's
As
hard
they
to
worked,
see in black and
they
white.
stumbled across
It's
a
not
lesser-known
just about
clip
how he
from
died.
the late 2000s.
It's about everything
Hogan,
he endured to get
backstage
there.
after a
The
match
report
in
details
Australia,
how
sat with a
cardiovascular
towel around his
complications
neck,
were the
talking to
immediate
a
cause of
camera
death.
for what seemed
But
like
it's the
a
contributing
personal
factors
project.
that raise
He
questions.
was still smiling,
Years
but
of
his
physical
voice was
trauma had
quieter than
placed
usual.
enormous strain
You
on his
know,
body.
brother, he said,
Spinal
when
compression
I go
from
out there,
repeated leg
I
drops,
forget the pain.
knee joint degeneration
I forget
from
the
countless
surgeries.
matches.
I forget
nerve
the doctor
damage
telling
from
me
neck
I should take
injuries.
it easy.
All of it took
All
a toll.
I hear is the crowd.
Doctors had long
And I
warned
think
him about the
one more
cumulative
match
damage.
won't hurt.
But
Hogan
one
was
more
a
turns
man
into
who
another
built his
and
identity
another
on
and
pushing through
yeah,
the pain.
It adds
And
up.
according to the autopsy,
Hearing those words now
that pain
felt
wasn't
almost
just
prophetic.
physical. It was
The
chemical.
team debated whether to
Toxicology
include it in the
results
results
showed
knowing
elevated
it
levels
might hit
of
too close
prescribed
to home.
painkillers and
But in the end,
anti-inflammatory
they
drugs,
decided it belonged
consistent
there,
with a
not
man
as a
managing
cautionary
severe
tale,
chronic
but
pain.
as an
There was
unfiltered
no
truth
sign of
from the
illegal
man himself.
substances, but
Back
the
in
report makes
Clearwater,
it clear
the
that his
family
body
kept
had been
finding
walking a
reminders
tightrope,
of the man
balancing
behind the
between
myth.
relief and danger.
A box of handwritten
In the weeks
letters
leading
from
up to his
children
passing,
battling illnesses,
friends noticed
thanking
Hogan
him for
seemed
visiting
more
their
withdrawn,
hospitals.
speaking
A pile
less
of
during
worn-out
public
gym
meet
shorts
and greets,
and tank tops,
often leaning
still
on furniture
smelling
for
faintly
support.
of the cologne he'd
It's now
worn for
believed
years.
those were early
And on his
signs of the
desk, a single sheet
cardiovascular
of
episode
paper
that
with
would
a note
ultimately
scrawled in
take
his
his life.
handwriting.
Yet,
Be remembered
even as
for
his
how
health
you made them
declined,
feel,
Hogan
not how
kept
you
his
made them
struggles
cheer.
private.
It was a line
years,
that struck
he
Brooke
had
like
been the
a
man who
lightning
told
bolt.
kids to
She
train,
read it out loud
say
to
your
Nick,
prayers,
and they both knew
eat your
instantly
vitamins.
it wasn't meant for the
Admitting
fans,
weakness
it was meant for
was
them,
never part
for
of
the
the
people in
script.
his life
In
who'd
the
seen
wrestling
both
world,
sides of the legend.
protecting the image
The autopsy
is as
might have
important
told the
as
world how
protecting the
Hulk
body.
Hogan died.
And so
But
the
these
public never saw the full
these
picture
memories
until now.
told the far
The
more
autopsy's
important
release
story
has
of how
sparked
he
a
lived,
wave of reaction
and how
from
every
fans
cheer,
and fellow wrestlers
every
alike.
slam, every
Tributes have
pose
poured
under
in,
the blinding
but
lights
so have
was
calls
fought
for
with the
greater
peace of
awareness
himself
about
he
the
could never
long-term
get
health
back.
risks of professional
And
wrestling.
as the waves rolled in outside
Inside the
mansion,
WWE,
Brooke and Nick
sources
sat together
say
in that
Hogan's death
familiar
and
living
the
room.
details of his
Tapes
autopsy
still
have
playing in the
reignited
background.
conversations
On the
about how the
screen,
company
their
supports
father
its
was in
legends
his
after
prime
they
again,
retire.
cupping
While
his
Hogan
hand to his
remained
ear
on
as
good
the
terms
crowd
with
roared.
WWE
But this
in his
time,
final years,
they didn't just see the
many
legend.
are now asking if
They
more
saw the
could
man.
have been done to
In the
help him
weeks
manage the
following
health
Hulk Hogan's
consequences
funeral,
of his career.
The shock that
Former
had once
colleagues
been
have
immediate
spoken
and
out in interviews,
overwhelming began
saying saying that the
settle into
industry has a
something deeper
responsibility
reflection.
to ensure
The
its
headlines
icons are
grew
not
smaller.
left to quietly
The media
suffer
trucks
once
left
the spotlight
Clearwater's
fades.
quiet streets.
The wrestling community,
But the conversations
always
his
quick
death
to
had
mythologize
sparked
its
didn't
heroes,
fade away.
is now
If
faced
anything,
with a more
they grew
complicated
louder in the
reality.
places where they
Hogan's
mattered
story
most.
was never
At
just about WWE
It was about
headquarters.
survival.
What began
And
as
in
an
the end,
emotional response
survival
started to
became
take the
harder
shape
and
of
harder
concrete
to
action.
achieve.
The autopsy notes quietly
multiple
assembled
organ
in the days
systems
after
showing
Hogan's
signs of
passing
long-term stress,
began drafting
particularly
proposals
his
for what some were already
cardiovascular
calling
and
the Hogan
musculoskeletal
protocol,
systems.
a comprehensive
These
wellness
findings
initiative
suggest
for
that
both
while the
active
immediate
and
cause of
retired
death was a
talent,
heart-related event,
it included
was a
annual
body-wide breakdown
cardiovascular
years in the
screenings,
making.
regular
In Clearwater,
musculoskeletal
Florida,
evaluations,
where Hogan
and
had
mandatory
lived for
mental
years,
health check-ins.
the news has
The
hit
discussions were
especially
fueled
hard.
by a hard truth.
Fans have been leaving
If the industry's
flowers,
biggest star could be
championship
brought
belts,
down
and
by the
handwritten
cumulative
letters
toll of his
outside
career,
his beachfront
so
mansion,
could anyone else.
One letter,
Triple
left
H,
anonymously,
who had been one of the
reads
most
simply,
vocal advocates
"Thank
for
you
change,
for being my hero,"
reportedly told
even
his
when you
inner
were hurting.
circle, "This
For many,
isn't about PR.
learning the truth
It's
about
about the next
Hogan's
30
final
years
days
of this
has
business.
deepened their respect
We
for
can't
him,
sell the idea of
not
heroes
diminished it.
and then let them
They
die
see a
in
man who
silence.
gave everything
The
to his
idea
fans,
wasn't without resistance.
even when it cost him
Some
everything.
old-school veterans
The media
bristled at what
coverage,
they saw
however,
as
has been
overprotection.
mixed.
Some
knew the
outlets
risks.
have chosen
One Hall
to
of
focus on
Famer
the more
said privately,
sensational aspects
"It's
of
not
the
ballet,
toxicology
brother."
report,
But the tide
while
was
others
turning.
have framed it
Younger
as a
wrestlers,
cautionary tale
those who
about
had
the
grown
hidden
up
toll
watching
of
Hogan,
fame
were
and
pushing
physical
for reforms.
sacrifice.
Their voices
Behind the
bolstered
scenes,
by the
there is
emotional
also
weight
quiet
of the
tension
story.
within Hogan's
Beyond
circle.
WWE,
The decision to
other
release the
promotions
autopsy
took
was not
notice.
unanimous.
AEW
Some
announced
family
a
members
new
reportedly
partnership with
felt it
sports
should have
medicine
remained
clinics
private,
to offer
a final
free
boundary
annual
around a
checkups
life
for all
that had been
contracted
lived
talent.
so publicly.
Smaller
But in the
independent
end,
companies
the
began
release was
pooling
seen as a way
resources
to
to
help
set the
injured
record
performers
straight,
get treatment
silence
without
the
bankrupting
endless
themselves.
speculation and
The fan
misinformation.
community, too,
Among
changed
wrestling
in subtle
insiders,
ways.
there's
Online
talk that
forums
Hogan knew
and
his
social
time was
media
short.
groups that had
In
once
the months
thrived on
before his
gossip
death,
and
he
criticism
reportedly
began
reached out
devoting
to several
threads to
old friends
wellness
and
and
rivals,
recovery,
making
peace
fans
where there
shared
had been
stories
bitterness,
of their own injuries,
reminiscing
their
about
own
their
brushes
shared
with
history.
chronic pain.
One former
Drawing
tag partner
parallels
said
between
Hogan had
themselves
confided
and the
in him about
athletes they
feeling worn
admired.
down
One
and
post
ready for
that
the
went
next
viral
chapter,
simply read,
whatever that is.
"We can't bring him
at
back."
the time, but
It
maybe
was
we
taken
can make
as a
sure no one else
philosophical
goes out
comment.
the same way.
Now,
in
in
Clearwater,
light of the
autopsy,
Brooke
it
and
feels
Nick
like a
watched
quiet
all of this
goodbye.
unfold with a
Perhaps
mix
the
of
most
pride
striking
and
part of the
bittersweet
autopsy
longing.
isn't the
They had
medical
never
jargon
set out to
or
make
the
their
cold,
father's death a
clinical
rallying
cause
cry.
of death.
But
If
if
the
the
truth
story
in
that
those
autopsy
findings
could
tell when
save
you
even
connect
one
them
life,
to the man's life,
they knew he would have wanted it told.
every injury, every surgery,
Nick, now
every
speaking
mile on
more
the
openly
road
in
left
interviews,
its mark.
began
Hulk
framing
Hogan
his
wasn't
father's
just a
legacy
performer.
in terms of
He was a
both
man who
triumph
lived
and
at the
warning.
edge of human
He was
limits
the
for
greatest,
decades.
he said in
And
one
like so
segment.
many in the industry,
But being the greatest
he paid
came
the
with a
price
price.
in the most personal
And
way.
if you love this business,
As fans
if you love your
process this new
family,
information,
you have to know when
there
to
is a
step back
growing
before it's
sense
too
that
late.
Hogan's legacy
Brooke,
will now be
meanwhile,
defined not
focused
just
on
by his
keeping her
in-ring
father's
achievements,
memory
but
alive
by
in
the
a way
honesty
that
of his
felt
final
authentic.
chapter. She
The
started a
truth
foundation
revealed
in
in
the
his name,
autopsy is
aimed at providing
uncomfortable,
health
but
and
it's
wellness
also
resources
humanizing.
for retired
It
wrestlers,
strips away the
especially
invincibility
those who
and
had
fallen
fallen
through
through
the
the
cracks
behind the
after leaving the
bandanas
spotlight.
and the booming promos
The logo
was
is
a man
simple,
who hurt,
just the word
who aged,
brother in
and
bold
who
yellow
eventually
script,
couldn't outwrestle
the way
the
he
inevitable.
used to say it,
And
with
yet,
the heart in
even in
place
death,
of though.
Hulk
And
Hogan
for the
remains
fans,
larger
the
than
memory
life.
of Hogan began
His
to
passing
evolve.
and the revelations
The yellow
that
and red
followed
hero
have
of the
reignited
80s
conversations
would always be
about
there.
health,
Frozen
loyalty,
in time on
and the
VHS
price of
tapes
living
and
as a
streaming
legend.
archives.
For those who grew
Flexing
up
to the
watching
roar
him,
of the crowd.
the news is
But now there was
bittersweet.
a second
The
image
hero may
alongside
be
it.
gone, but the
The
memories
man
remain.
who, in his final days,
And now, so
faced
does
the
the
truth
truth
of his body's
what the
limits
media
and
didn't tell you
still carried
before.
himself with
The
dignity.
autopsy has made
As one
impossible
longtime
to
fan
ignore.
wrote in a
The
tribute
question
article,
now is whether
we
the
loved
wrestling
him because
world
he
will
made
learn
us
from it,
believe in
or
heroes.
whether Hogan's fate
Now we
will be
love
just
him
another
because he
chapter
reminded us
in a
heroes
long line
are
of
human
tragedies
too.
that could have
Months
been
later,
prevented.
on a warm
The
summer
shock is
night
still
in Tampa,
fresh.
the
The grief is
WWE
still raw.
hosted a special
But in the
event
coming
in Hogan's
days,
honor.
as the initial
It wasn't a
headlines
pay-per-view.
fade,
The
there were
deeper
no
story will
scripted
remain.
feuds,
No
the
over-the-top
story of a
promos.
man who lived for
Just
his
a ring in the
fans,
middle of the
who
arena,
sacrificed his
surrounded
body
by
for the
thousands
love
of
of the
fans
business,
wearing Hulkamania
and
shirts,
whose final moments
one by
are now
one,
forever
wrestlers
etched in the
from
cold
every
lines
era
of an
an
came out to
autopsy
speak.
report.
Some sharing
And
funny road
perhaps,
stories,
just perhaps,
others talking
that
about the
truth will
lessons
inspire
they've learned
change,
from
so
Hogan's
that
generosity
future
and
legends
drive.
won't have to follow
Toward
the
the end of the
path
night,
to the same
the lights
end.
dimmed,
As
and
the
on
sun
the big
dipped
screen,
fully beneath the
they played
horizon,
that
backstage
clip from
Clearwater,
Australia,
a warm
the one
breeze
where
swept
Hogan
across
had
the
quietly
lawn where
admitted
Hulk
how much
Hogan's
the
casket
years had taken
stood
from
only
him.
hours
When it
earlier.
ended, the arena
The
was
sound of the
silent,
waves had
and
faded
then,
into the
slowly,
distance,
the chant
replaced
began.
by a heavy,
Thank you,
almost
Hogan.
tangible stillness.
Thank you, Hogan.
Guests had
It was a
begun to
chant
drift
that
away
rolled
in
like
twos
a
and
wave
threes,
through the crowd,
offering quiet
rising
hugs
and
and
falling
murmured
until it
condolences
became
before
almost
slipping
musical.
into the dark.
In that
But
moment,
inside the house,
it didn't matter
the
whether
real
fans
goodbyes
were thinking
were
of the
still being
wrestler
spoken,
or the man.
not to the
They
wrestler
were thinking
the
of
world
someone
had
who had
adored,
given them a piece
but
of
to the man
himself
they knew
and
as Terry,
who,
in
the
leaving,
living room,
had given them a
lit
chance
only by
to
the
protect
glow
the
of a
next
single
generation
lamp.
from the
Brooke
same
sat
fate.
with her father's
And
old
somewhere
guitar
in the
across
minds of
her
those
lap.
who knew him best,
It was badly
they
out
could
of
almost
tune.
hear his voice
Its surface
answering
worn
back,
smooth from years
warm
of casual
and familiar,
strumming,
but
What
she
you
held
gonna
it like
do,
it was
brother?
made of gold.
Only this time,
She plucked at the
the
strings
answer was
absent-mindedly.
They were
telling
going to
a
remember.
small group of friends
They were
how
going
her
to
father
change.
had once tried
And
to
they
write
were
a
going to
country
make sure
song
the
in
price
middle
he
of the
paid
night
was
after
never
a
paid
long
again.
road trip. 1 year
It was
later,
awful, she
Clearwater
said,
looked
smiling
almost
through her
exactly
tears.
the same.
But he
The
made
waves
me
still
sing
rolled
back
in
up
under
anyway.
the same Florida
He
sun.
said it would bond
the
us
breeze
as musicians.
still carried the salt of the Gulf.
In the kitchen,
and Hogan's
Nick
mansion
leaned
still
against the
stood
counter,
proud on the
talking
shoreline.
quietly with one of his
But for
father's
those who knew the
oldest
story,
friends
there
from
was
the
a
wrestling
quiet difference
circuit.
in the air.
They
because
spoke
this
about the
time
road,
last year,
the kind of
the
endless
man who had
travel
made
that
millions
few believe
outside
in
the
business
business
can
had taken his
comprehend.
final bow,
And about the
and in the 12
sacrifices
months
no
since,
one ever sees.
the wrestling
He
industry
loved it,
had not
man.
forgotten. Nick said,
The
shaking
Hogan
his
protocol.
head. He
Once
loved
just
the
an
crowd,
idea discussed
but I
in
think
hushed
deep down
boardroom
he knew it
meetings
was killing him.
was now a
He
reality.
just didn't want to stop.
Every contracted
Upstairs,
WWE
in
Hogan's
wrestler,
study,
from the
a
top
small
champions
group of
to
close
the
friends
newest
and family
developmental
members
talent,
gathered around
underwent
a mahogany
mandatory
desk cluttered
quarterly
with
health
memorabilia,
screenings,
cardiovascular
Polaroids from the
tests,
80s,
joint
stacks
and
of
spine
fan
letters
assessments,
tied together
full
with
mental health
fraying string.
evaluations,
And a few
retired
unopened
legends were
packages
offered
that had
the same,
arrived in the weeks
free of
before
charge,
his death.
with
Brooke
transportation
opened one
arranged for those
carefully.
unable to
Inside
travel.
was a handmade
On the
belt,
independent circuit,
crafted from
where
cardboard
resources
and
were
covered
thinner,
in gold foil.
promoters began
with
working
Hulkamania
together,
forever
pooling
written
funds
in black
to provide
marker.
similar
The
medical
return
access
address
for their
belonged
performers.
to a 10-year-old
AW
fan from
had
Iowa.
expanded its
A
wellness
tear
program,
slipped down her cheek
and
as she
even
said it
international
gently on the
promotions
desk.
had quietly reached
These
out
were the
to
pieces
adopt
of
elements
Hogan's
of
life
the new
that
standard.
never made it into the spotlight.
The changes
The
weren't
quiet
just
moments,
procedural.
they
They
were
were
tangible
cultural.
proof of how
Wrestlers
deeply
no
he had
longer
touched
whispered
people.
about injuries,
But the
for
release of
fear
the
losing
autopsy
their spot
report had made
they
privacy
spoke openly
almost
about
impossible
recovery,
now.
treatment,
Even as the
and
family tried to
importance
focus
of
on their
longevity.
grief,
The
the
old
outside
mantra
world
of push
kept
through
intruding.
it had been replaced
News
with
fans
something new.
still lingered a
Make
few
it home
blocks
in
away.
one piece.
Reporters
Fans
hoping
noticed
for a
the
quote
difference.
or a glimpse of the
Social
mourners.
media threads that
Social
once
media
celebrated
churned with
dangerous
debates
stunts
about the
without
details of
question
his
were
death.
now peppered with
Some
comments
posts
about
celebrated
safety
his legacy
and
without
sustainability.
question.
Tribute
Others
accounts
picked apart
posted
every
not just
line of the
highlights,
toxicology
but behind the
report,
scenes clips
speculating
of
about
wrestlers
the pills
laughing,
found in his
training,
system,
and
the
enjoying
strain
time
on
away
his
from the
heart,
ring.
the
Reminders
surgeries
that
that
the
had
people
kept him
behind the
moving
characters
long past
deserved
the
to
point
live
most
long
men
after
would
the
have stopped.
storylines ended. Back in
For
Stamford,
Brooke and Nick, the past
WWE's
year had
corporate
been both
offices were
exhausting
still
and
buzzing.
healing.
Though the
Brother
tribute videos
Foundation,
had aired on
launched
television
in their father's
and the
name,
social media
had
posts
already
been
funded
made,
more than
the
200
internal
meetings
meetings
had
had
not
not for
stopped.
retired wrestlers who had
For the
long
first
since
time in
left the
years,
public eye.
executives were
Some of
openly
those
discussing
checkups
the
had caught
possibility
early signs
of
of the same
comprehensive
issues
health
that had
programs
plagued
for
Hogan,
retired
issues
talent.
that could now be treated
One
before it was
proposal
too late.
included yearly physicals.
In July,
Mental
they returned
health
to Tampa for a
evaluations,
charity
and
event
a dedicated
organized by
fund for long-term
WWE.
care.
Something
The main
many
stage
wrestlers
was set
had
in the
lobbied
middle
for in the
of an
past,
outdoor arena,
but that had
ring
always
ropes
been
glowing
dismissed
under
as
the
too
summer
expensive.
lights.
On
Now,
the big screen,
with Hogan's death
Hogan's
and the
most
very
iconic
public
details
moments
of his
played,
decline,
the slam on
igniting
Andre,
outrage
the
among
post-downs,
fans,
the
the
entrances where
conversation
he could
cupped
no
his ear
longer
to
be
the
avoided.
crowd.
But
Hulk,
in between
Triple
the
H,
flash
and
and
spectacle,
now one of the most
production
powerful
team had
figures
woven
in
in quieter
WWE.
moments.
Hogan
Reportedly
holding a
told the
child's
board,
hand at a
"If
hospital
this doesn't
visit,
wake us up,
hugging a
nothing
Make-A-Wish
will.
kid,
We can't
walking
keep losing our
slowly
legends
to the ring
like
in
this
his later
and
years
pretend
with a
it's just
determined
fate."
smile.
His words
When
were
the
met
video
with
ended,
nods,
the
but
crowd
also
stood
with
in
the
a
silent
long,
understanding that
sustained
change in
ovation.
wrestling,
Brooke
like
stepped up to
any
the
long-standing
microphone,
institution,
her voice steady.
comes slowly.
My dad lived
in
his
the
life
locker
giving
rooms,
everything
both
he
in
had to the people who
WWE
cheered for
and
him.
on the
The
independent
last
circuit.
gift he gave was a
Hogan's
lesson
death had become a
that
kind
we
of
have to take care of
unspoken
each other
measuring stick
in this business and in
Wrestlers
life.
in their
This
30s
protocol,
and 40s
this
were
change,
suddenly
this
reassessing
future,
their
it's
schedules,
his legacy,
their diets,
and it's our
their
promise.
pain management.
Nick followed,
A few even
speaking
quietly
more
canceled
softly,
bookings,
but with equal
choosing
weight.
instead to
He
rest
always
injuries
said,
that they
"What you
might
gonna
have
do,
worked
brother?"
through in the past.
Well,
I don't
we
want to
answered
end up
him.
another headline.
And as if on
one
cue,
veteran told
the
a
crowd
friend
began to
backstage
chant.
at a small show
Not
in
the
Chicago.
old chant.
I
A
don't
new
want my
one.
kid reading an
A
autopsy
promise.
to find out
Take
what
care.
really happened to me.
Take care.
The ripple
Take care.
effect extended
It rolled
far
through the
beyond
arena,
wrestling.
from the front row to the
Sports radio show hosts debated
and
the
for a
ethics
moment
of
it physically
physically
punishing
punishing
careers,
careers,
performer
comparing
and fan,
wrestling to
between
boxing
legend
and
and
football
mortal,
in its long-term
had
toll on
disappeared.
the body.
Back in Clearwater,
Documentarians
the beach
began
was
reaching
quiet
out to
again
Hogan's
that night.
friends and
The
former
waves moved
colleagues,
in and out,
hoping
the
to create
moonlight
an
danced
danced on the
look at
water
his life,
and somewhere
and the
in the way the wind
circumstances of his
shifted.
death. In the
And
rhythm
at
of the
gyms across
tide,
the country,
you could almost
fans,
hear the
some
echo
wearing
of a
vintage
voice that had
Hulkamania
filled
shirts,
arenas for decades,
shared their own memories
not
of how
asking
Hogan
a
had
question this
inspired
time,
them to lift
just
their first
saying
dumbbell,
goodbye,
step
and
into
the
a
world
ring,
finally
or stand up
answering
for
back.
themselves. Through it all, one question kept surfacing: how much of Hulk Hogan's decline could have been prevented? And how much was simply the price he was willing to pay to be the icon everyone needed him to be? For Brooke and Nick, those were questions without answers. In the days after the funeral, they spent hours going through their father's belongings, each item triggering another memory. A tattered bandana from WrestleMania 3. A pair of boots worn so many times the soles had been replaced twice. Dozens of photographs from hospital beds, where he still managed to flash a peace sign or a thumbs up for the camera. "He didn't hide the pain from us," Brooke said quietly one afternoon, holding one of the boots in her lap. But he didn't let it define him either. He was bigger than it. Bigger than everything, even at the end. Nick, staring out the window at the shimmering Gulf waters, nodded. "Yeah, but I wish he'd let himself be Terry more often. Not just Hulk Hogan." And maybe that was the heart of it, the part the autopsy couldn't capture, the part that no headline could sum up. Hulk Hogan's body may have given out, but Terry Bollea had never stopped living for the people around him, for the fans, for the roar of the crowd he could still hear in his mind. It would be weeks before the media frenzy around his death began to fade. But even when the cameras moved on, the conversations he had sparked continued in boardrooms, in locker rooms, in living rooms where families watched old matches and told stories about the man who had been a hero to so many. And somewhere in Clearwater, on a quiet stretch of beach, the waves kept rolling in, carrying with them the echoes of a voice that had once boomed through arenas around the world. "What you gonna do, brother?" Only this time, there was no answer, just the silence left by a legend. In the days after the funeral, Clearwater felt different. Locals spoke about it in passing. How the beach seemed quieter, how the restaurants Hogan used to visit kept his table empty for a week, how the gym where he once trained still played his entrance music every morning at opening. But for those closest to him, the stillness wasn't in the streets, it was in their own memories, memories that had begun to surface with an intensity they hadn't expected. It was Brooke who first broke the silence, sitting in her father's recliner one afternoon, a stack of old VHS tapes balanced on her knees. She pressed play on one, and the grainy image flickered to life. WrestleMania 3, the Pontiac Silverdome, 93,000 fans on their feet. On screen, Hogan was in his prime, skin glistening under the lights, jaw set in determination as he faced down Andre the Giant. The crowd's roar was deafening. Brooke remembered watching it live as a little girl, too young to understand the magnitude of what she was seeing, but old enough to feel that her dad was doing something extraordinary. And then came the slam. The moment replayed endlessly in wrestling history, the sheer impossibility of it. Hogan's back arched, muscles straining as he lifted Andre off the mat and drove him down. The arena exploded. But as Brooke watched it now, her eyes drifted from the spectacle to the small details, the twist of his knees under the weight, the way his face tightened in a flash of pain before he smiled. She wondered if that was one of the moments that started it all, the microscopic tears, the stress on his spine, the first domino in a chain that would one day lead to the medical findings in that autopsy. Nick had his own flashback. Sitting alone in his father's garage, he remembered being 12 years old, traveling with Hogan on the road during summer break. They were in some small-town arena, far from the glitz of pay-per-view events. Hogan was booked in the main event, and Nick had been allowed to watch from backstage. He remembered the sound of his father's boots hitting the mat, the way he'd play to the crowd even when he was obviously hurting. After the match, Nick saw him peel off his gear and wince as he lowered himself into a chair. He wrapped ice packs around both knees, one after the other, and then, almost like flipping a switch, he stood up, smiled, and went to meet fans by the barricade. Even back then, Nick realized now his father was working through pain no one else could see. The cameras didn't catch the limp when he walked back to the locker room, or the way he needed help getting up the steps to the bus afterward. Those moments lived only in the shadows, invisible until the truth came out in that cold, clinical autopsy report decades later. Other friends shared their own vignettes. A fellow wrestler recalled the long overseas tours in the early 90s, where Hogan would wrestle night after night, sometimes twice in a day, barely sleeping between flights. He'd sit there in the airport, sunglasses on, looking like a rock star, the friends said, but under the table, he'd be rubbing his hip or stretching his back. And we all did it. That's just how it was. One former rival remembered a match in Tokyo where Hogan took an awkward fall and landed hard on his shoulder. Backstage, they thought he might have torn something. But when his music hit for the encore appearance, he walked back out, flexing and grinning as though nothing had happened. "That's the thing about Terry," the rival said softly. He knew the fans had paid to see Hulk Hogan, not a guy nursing an injury. But every time he did that, he was making a deal with his body he couldn't keep forever. As these memories spilled out in kitchens, on porches, and in late-night phone calls between friends, a picture began to form, not of a man brought down suddenly by fate, but of a man who had spent 40 years giving more than his body could ever repay. The autopsy hadn't revealed anything new to those who knew him best. It had simply confirmed what they had quietly feared for years. In Stamford, the WWE production team began sifting through decades of footage for a documentary tribute. As they worked, they stumbled across a lesser-known clip from the late 2000s. Hogan, backstage after a match in Australia, sat with a towel around his neck, talking to a camera for what seemed like a personal project. He was still smiling, but his voice was quieter than usual. "You know, brother," he said, "when I go out there, I forget the pain. I forget the surgeries. I forget the doctor telling me I should take it easy. All I hear is the crowd. And I think, one more match won't hurt. But one more turns into another, and yeah, it adds up." Hearing those words now felt almost prophetic. The team debated whether to include it in the tribute, knowing it might hit too close to home. But in the end, they decided it belonged there, not as a cautionary tale, but as an unfiltered truth from the man himself. Back in Clearwater, the family kept finding reminders of the man behind the myth. A box of handwritten letters from children battling illnesses, thanking him for visiting their hospitals. A pile of worn-out gym shorts and tank tops, still smelling faintly of the cologne he'd worn for years. And on his desk, a single sheet of paper with a note scrawled in his handwriting: "Be remembered for how you made them feel, not how you made them cheer." It was a line that struck Brooke like a lightning bolt. She read it out loud to Nick, and they both knew instantly it wasn't meant for the fans, it was meant for them, for the people in his life who'd seen both sides of the legend. The autopsy might have told the world how Hulk Hogan died. But these flashbacks, these memories, told the far more important story of how he lived, and how every cheer, every slam, every pose under the blinding lights was bought with a piece of himself he could never get back. And as the waves rolled in outside the mansion, Brooke and Nick sat together in that familiar living room, tapes still playing in the background. On the screen, their father was in his prime again, cupping his hand to his ear as the crowd roared. But this time, they didn't just see the legend. They saw the man. In the weeks following Hulk Hogan's funeral, the shock that had once been immediate and overwhelming began to settle into something deeper: reflection. The headlines grew smaller. The media trucks left Clearwater's quiet streets. But the conversations his death had sparked didn't fade away. If anything, they grew louder in the places where they mattered most. At WWE headquarters, what began as an emotional response started to take the shape of concrete action. A task force, quietly assembled in the days after Hogan's passing, began drafting proposals for what some were already calling the Hogan Protocol, a comprehensive wellness initiative for both active and retired talent. It included annual cardiovascular screenings, regular musculoskeletal evaluations, and mandatory mental health check-ins. The discussions were fueled by a hard truth: if the industry's biggest star could be brought down by the cumulative toll of his career, so could anyone else. Triple H, who had been one of the most vocal advocates for change, reportedly told his inner circle, "This isn't about PR. It's about the next 30 years of this business. We can't sell the idea of heroes and then let them die in silence." The idea wasn't without resistance. Some old-school veterans bristled at what they saw as overprotection. "We knew the risks," one Hall of Famer said privately. "It's not ballet, brother." But the tide was turning. Younger wrestlers, those who had grown up watching Hogan, were pushing for reforms, their voices bolstered by the emotional weight of his story. Beyond WWE, other promotions took notice. AEW announced a new partnership with sports medicine clinics to offer free annual checkups for all contracted talent. Smaller independent companies began pooling resources to help injured performers get treatment without bankrupting themselves. The fan community, too, changed in subtle ways. Online forums and social media groups that had once thrived on gossip and criticism began devoting threads to wellness and recovery. Fans shared stories of their own injuries, their own brushes with chronic pain, drawing parallels between themselves and the athletes they admired. One post that went viral simply read, "We can't bring him back, but maybe we can make sure no one else goes out the same way." In Clearwater, Brooke and Nick watched all of this unfold with a mix of pride and bittersweet longing. They had never set out to make their father's death a rallying cry, but if the truth in that autopsy could save even one life, they knew he would have wanted it told. Nick, now speaking more openly in interviews, began framing his father's legacy in terms of both triumph and warning. He was the greatest, he said in one segment. But being the greatest came with a price. And if you love this business, if you love your family, you have to know when to step back before it's too late. Brooke, meanwhile, focused on keeping her father's memory alive in a way that felt authentic. She started a foundation in his name, aimed at providing health and wellness resources for retired wrestlers, especially those who had fallen through the cracks after leaving the spotlight. The logo was simple, just the word brother in bold yellow script, the way he used to say it, with a heart in place of the O. And for the fans, the memory of Hogan began to evolve. The yellow and red hero of the 80s would always be there, frozen in time on VHS tapes and streaming archives, flexing to the roar of the crowd. But now there was a second image alongside it. The man who, in his final days, faced the truth of his body's limits and still carried himself with dignity. As one longtime fan wrote in a tribute article, "We loved him because he made us believe in heroes. Now we love him because he reminded us heroes are human, too." Months later, on a warm summer night in Tampa, WWE hosted a special event in Hogan's honor. It wasn't a pay-per-view. There were no